The wind slipped through the cracked window pane of the nurse's station, brushing against the corner of an old clipboard and rustling a few loose pages. On the far wall, a round clock ticked in steady rhythm, then gave a louder click as the hands aligned at 2:15 a.m. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed faintly. It cast a soft, tired glow, yellowed with age, like the walls it barely lit. Margaret sat at the edge of her chair, close to the space heater that hadn't worked right since October. She poured hot water into a chipped ceramic mug and dropped in a sachet of jasmine tea from her coat pocket. Her fingers trembled slightly, not enough to spill, just enough to notice. She wasn't sure if it was the cold or the years. She pulled her white coat tighter across her chest. The silence of the night shift held steady around her. Not a dramatic kind of silence, just the kind that settles when everyone is asleep and no one needs saving. Not yet. Outside the window, a row of cactus plants leaned in the wind, their silhouettes dark and hunched like tired men. Some were missing limbs, some had gone bare. Still, they stood there, weathered, stubborn, holding on. She took a slow sip of tea. Warmth moved down her throat like a kindness she didn't expect. She glanced up at the clock again, then covered it with her hand. Somehow, seeing the hour made it worse. It was still 2:15, still winter, still the kind of night no one wants to wake up in unless they have to. She didn't think much anymore, not like she used to. After 42 years, a night shift wasn't something to analyze. It was just a stretch of time to wait out. She no longer dreamed of medicine. No one waited at home. Margaret rested her elbows on the table, fingers laced loosely. The dim light drew a soft gold outline around her thinning hair, now almost fully gray. Her face gave little away, but the stillness in her posture spoke of a fatigue that wasn't about sleep. It was the kind that settles in by degrees, like dust behind an old cabinet, quiet, familiar, and rarely disturbed. She had worn white for 42 years, 42 years of name tags, chart notes, hallway footsteps, and whispered instructions, 42 years of listening to people breathe and stop breathing. Some thought she had healing hands, but Margaret knew it wasn't her hands that helped. It was knowing when to speak and when to simply hold someone's fingers and let them cry. The wedding band still circled her left ring finger, dull now, the gold worn smooth. Leonard had been gone for 3 years. February morning. He collapsed in the living room, no warning, no noise, just gone. Margaret never took the ring off, not because she couldn't let go, she just hadn't seen the point. Retirement was 2 weeks away, 13 days to be exact. She'd filed the papers, packed her drawer, labeled the charts for her replacement. It was all moving toward closure, neatly, quietly, the way she preferred things. She told herself she'd tend to the tomato beds once spring came, reread Leonard's dog-eared novels, maybe visit the library twice a week. No one asked her what came next. If they had, that would have been her answer. She sipped her tea again, eyes wandering down the corridor where one of the bulbs flickered every so often. This winter felt colder than most. Or maybe she was simply older now. Margaret pulled her collar close and tilted her head gently against the back of the chair. She closed her eyes for a moment, not to sleep, just to be still. But then there was a small sound, far down the hallway, and she opened her eyes again. There it was again. Not the wind this time, though it could have passed for that. Soft, uneven, almost like it didn't want to be heard, but it was there. A sound that didn't belong to the hallway, or the hum of the lights, or the silence Margaret had grown used to. She stood slowly, left the tea on the table, still warm. The corridor stretched ahead, dim and bare. A light flickered overhead, briefly casting a shadow, then pulling it back. The sound led her to exam room 3. The door was slightly ajar. She pushed it open gently. No one had scheduled use of the room that night. No patients, no staff, but someone had been there. A child lay curled on the exam table, small, motionless except for the rise and fall of breath. There was no blanket, no bag, no note taped to the door, just the child. Margaret stepped forward without speaking. The child turned his face toward her, eyes wide, dark, silent. He didn't pry, didn't reach out, just watched her. She touched his wrist. His skin was cold, colder than it should have been for indoors. His clothes were thin and slightly damp, the collar of his sweater soaked from tears or maybe weather. His fists were clenched, his arms drawn tight to his chest. She took off her white coat and wrapped it around him. The coat swallowed him whole. He didn't resist. There was a single piece of paper, folded once, sitting by his feet. Not an envelope, not even a full sheet. She picked it up and opened it carefully. 3 words written in hurried, uneven script. I'm sorry. No name, no date, nothing more. She sat beside the table and held the note in one hand, the edge trembling ever so slightly between her fingers. She looked at the boy again, still watching her, still silent. There was no one else in the room, no answers, no signs of who he was or where he came from. He had been left behind, quietly, without an introduction, like someone putting something down and walking away. And though she said nothing, not even to herself, Margaret knew that this moment would not pass like the others. Something had shifted, something had arrived. She just didn't know his name yet. Margaret laid the boy down gently on the staff lounge bench. The coat she'd wrapped around him had begun to hold a little warmth. The room was as quiet as it always was at this hour, only now there was an extra breath in the air, faint and thread-like. She called the social services line. A woman answered, her voice flat, neither impatient nor particularly kind. The usual questions came. Margaret answered them one by one, brief and clear. In the end, they said someone would come in the morning, around 8. They told her to keep the child there, as if he could simply be left on a shelf. Margaret hung up. She looked at the phone for a moment, then didn't dial again. The boy didn't cry, didn't sleep. His eyes stayed open, wide and still. Not afraid, not searching, as if he already knew not to expect anyone to answer back. Margaret sat beside him, her hands resting quietly on her knees. She didn't speak. She looked at him and then at the space between them, bare, weightless. She thought of the morning Leonard died, early, cold, and still, just like this. She remembered the house then, kitchen light still on, his coffee untouched on the table. He didn't answer the first time she called out, or the second. When she found him, the room had no sound left in it, only the clock ticking softly from the wall. Everything that followed happened quickly and slowly. And then there was the emptiness. It had lasted 3 years. No one had sat with her then. Margaret drew in a breath and let it go slowly. She was not someone easily swayed. In her life, she has seen many children, many goodbyes, many people who didn't make it. But this felt different. Not out of pity, but because somewhere quietly she knew if she didn't do something, no one would. The boy had no name, no age, nothing but 3 words scribbled on a slip of paper. I'm sorry. Margaret pulled the chair closer, eased him over just slightly, and sat next to him, their shoulders almost touching. Neither spoke, but in the silence there was something unmistakably shared, a kind of unspoken agreement. When the wall clock struck 3:05, Margaret opened the desk drawer and took out a blank intake form. She filled in her name under temporary guardian. Her handwriting was slow, steady, unshaken. Margaret adjusted the coat around the boy's body, tugging it gently up toward his chin. The fabric was thin at the shoulders, worn for years of use, but it still held a trace of warmth. She had worn that coat during her first winter night shifts more than 40 years ago. She'd never needed it in years, but had never thrown it out. Some things you just kept. The form lay open on the desk beneath the soft yellow light. She filled in the final lines with her usual steady hand. Under temporary guardian, she wrote, Margaret L. James. Date, January 27th.
Time, 3:12 a.m. Her signature was neat, with no extra flourish. She set the pen down, no sigh, no smile, just a quiet sense that something had shifted, like closing one door behind you and resting your hand on the next, not yet open, but no longer locked. The boy was still awake, eyes open, unmoving. He didn't stir, didn't make a sound, just waited. Margaret leaned slightly toward him, bringing her face closer to his, not expecting a response, not asking for one. She only wanted to speak the moment aloud, to name it, because too many things in this world went by unnamed. We have to call you something, she said softly. She looked up, her thoughts sifting through names stored somewhere far back. After a few quiet seconds, she spoke again, low, almost to herself. Ethan. She didn't repeat it, didn't explain why. His name now was Ethan. That night, Margaret gave the boy a name, Ethan. Then she sat beside him until morning. Nothing changed all at once. It was simply another day beginning, with the quiet breakfast and unfamiliar eyes looking back at her. Ethan stayed, first a few weeks, then a few months. Margaret quietly completed the paperwork. She didn't talk about it much, didn't explain herself, just said, "There's a boy at my house now." Ethan grew like a seed in the corner of a garden, quietly, steadily. Little by little, mornings began to include a second bowl on the table, a smaller pair of shoes at the door, and the sound of footsteps running down the hallway. It wasn't always easy, but something, slowly, began to fill the spaces. And so the warm years began, not with grand gestures, but with the smallest things. Toast in the morning, a pair of little shoes tucked by the mat, or the sound of a child's laughter cutting through an ordinary afternoon. One morning began with the soft pop of the toaster. Margaret stood at the sink slicing bread. Her hands didn't need to look. After all these years, they knew the motion. The scent of bread drifted through the small kitchen, mixing with the trace of coffee, slipping out the cracked window above the stove. At the table, Ethan sat upright, legs swinging slightly beneath his chair. He was coloring with a set of pencils, the tip of his tongue peeking from the side of his mouth, a sign he was concentrating. Margaret poured milk into a glass. "Put on your coat before you eat," she said, not looking back. Ethan didn't reply, but the soft patter of his feet said she'd been heard. They ate in silence, not the cold kind, just the kind where words weren't needed. Ethan chewed slowly and nodded when Margaret asked, gently, "Eggs okay today?" He smiled, a small, true smile, like sunlight filtering through the edge of a curtain. In the afternoon, he sat at the kitchen table, doing homework. A warm yellow light washed over his books. Margaret cooked just a few feet away, glancing over now and then.
She didn't speak, but she noticed everything. The way he twisted the pencil between his fingers, the way his brow furrowed over a long sentence. There was something whole and quiet in the picture, like the outside world had been gently left beyond the door. One night, as she bent to adjust his pillow, Ethan reached up and touched her hair. His small fingers slipped through a few silver strands, then paused. "Why isn't your hair black like mine?" he asked. Margaret smiled, didn't answer right away. She kissed his forehead and pulled the blanket up to his chin. "Because I've lived longer than you. The longer you live, the lighter your hair becomes." "So your hair is like light?" he asked, his voice already drifting into sleep. Margaret didn't answer, but she stood at the doorway a little longer, watching him breathe. There was something in her chest, just a quiet ache. Not sorrow exactly, more like the feeling of holding something fragile, something precious. The next day was Sunday. The sky hung low and gray. After morning service, Mrs. Ruth, Margaret's neighbor, walked up beside her, holding a Bible wrapped in lace. "You've been on your own for quite a while now," Mrs. Ruth said. Her voice wasn't nosy exactly, just hovering near the edge of concern. "Maybe it's time you thought about keeping someone company. It might ease the loneliness." Margaret gave a soft smile, the kind that closed the door gently rather than slamming it. "I don't feel like anything's missing," she said. In the early days after Ethan came home, Margaret sometimes wondered if she could still love someone in the way people meant. Not out of need, but out of habit. A quiet part of the heart still checking its own pulse. One Sunday morning at church, she caught the gaze of Mr. William, a widower who always came early to set out the folding chairs. His look wasn't bold, just a hesitation, as if to ask, "Would you like to sit beside me?" Margaret nodded a polite hello, then took a seat one row over. Not hurried, not evasive, just a choice. She greeted him every week after that, but the look never came again, and she didn't miss it. Some nights, when Ethan had fallen asleep, Margaret would check over his school clothes and supplies. One evening, she found a small tear in the sleeve of his coat, not large, but enough to let the cold in. She turned on the small lamp above the counter and began stitching by hand. The thread moved slow and even. Her fingers were no longer soft, calloused from years of scissors, forceps, and holding the hands of the sick, but they still sewed neatly. She didn't think of it as sacrifice. She didn't call it love either. It was just what her hands knew to do, like pouring milk, lining up books, or resting a palm on a forehead before the weather turned. One night, when Ethan had fallen asleep, Margaret sat still on the edge of the bed. "I'm right here," she whispered, unsure if he could still hear her. But maybe the words weren't only for him. On nights like that, Margaret often sat a little longer by his bed, and in the mornings, things went on as usual. Only with Ethan, some things came naturally without needing to be taught. He always said thank you after meals, not in the way children sometimes say it out of habit or prompting, but with a slight tilt of his head, a soft but steady voice, as if gratitude was something sacred, even if it was just scrambled eggs and 2 slices of toast. Margaret never told him to do it. He just did, regularly, quietly, as if it were part of breathing. One morning, while Margaret was still brushing her teeth, she heard the soft rustle of fabric from the small bedroom. Ethan was awake, folding his blanket. Not perfectly, but neatly. He didn't look to the door, didn't wait to be praised. He simply did it. Margaret never commented on things like that, but she noticed all of them, like one might notice how a tree grows taller each season, even when no one is measuring. Ethan laughed easily, especially when Margaret tried to tell jokes, the kind of clumsy jokes from someone who hadn't spoken to a child in a long time. Once, she put her reading glasses on upside down while reading a story. Ethan burst into giggles until his cheeks flushed red. The kitchen felt brighter when he laughed. Margaret didn't laugh out loud with him, but her lips curved slightly, enough to say she was glad. He was easily moved, too. One rainy afternoon, Margaret heard a light knock at the back door. Ethan stood there, holding a small, soaked kitten in his arms. His eyes were red. "She's shaking," he said, his voice uneven. Margaret didn't ask where the kitten came from. She simply took a towel, dried it gently, and handed Ethan a small blanket. He sat down, placed the kitten on a pillow, and kept his hand lightly on its back, as if even a little pressure might hurt it. He didn't leave until nightfall, not until the kitten stopped trembling. Margaret never called Ethan a good boy in front of others, but in her heart, he was something so pure that it sometimes made her pause in the middle of washing dishes or folding laundry just to look at him and wonder, how does a child who was abandoned grow up to be this gentle? Not all children are like that, she knew. And maybe that was why she loved him just a little more. Not just for what he had once lacked, but for what he quietly became.
Ethan started reading early. At first, it was the words on street signs, then labels on milk cartons. And later, pages from old comic books Margaret kept around just to keep him curious. By the time he was 4, he could read simple stories aloud without stumbling and write full sentences in pencil, slanted but neat. Margaret didn't show surprise, but after that, she began picking up books with more text and fewer pictures at the secondhand store. One day, she handed him a 3rd-grade math workbook, just to see. He finished the first page that same afternoon, but didn't say much about it. He liked looking at the sky more. One afternoon, after school, Margaret noticed the back door was ajar. She stepped outside and found Ethan crouched on the cement, a stub of white chalk in hand. A large circle in the middle, smaller ones around it. The names of planets in block letters: Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars. He looked up when he saw her, eyes lit with something bright and earnest. "I read about it in a book. Jupiter's the biggest, Neptune's the farthest, but I like Saturn the most. It has rings." Margaret nodded and sat in a plastic chair nearby. She didn't interrupt, just watched, her hands folded in her lap. Ethan kept talking a while, then fell quiet. He stood, brushed the chalk dust from his palms, and walked over. "Do you think I could work up there someday?" he asked. It wasn't a joke, and he didn't need an answer, just someone to hear him. Margaret didn't rush her reply. She brushed his hair back gently with her fingers and said, "If you want to, and if you believe you can." A few weeks later, Ethan's teacher called. Her voice on the phone carried a quiet mix of wonder and care. "He's very special," she said. "He picks things up faster than most, but what really stands out is he's not boastful. He's generous, gentle." Margaret only said, "I know." Not with pride, but with the quiet steadiness of someone who had seen it all along and was still learning how to carry it. Ethan never asked why learning came easier to him. He simply learned, then smiled,
then told her about it like it was just another part of the day. But Margaret knew, when a child is bright and kind and full of wonder, the world offers them many roads. And sometimes that's how people get lost. Margaret knew, too, intelligence didn't erase the past. Some things don't live in the mind, but in memory. And memory has its own shape, unspoken, unnamed, still present. Ethan didn't say much about it, but she could tell he carried it with him. There were questions he never asked aloud, but she knew they were there. One weekend afternoon, while cleaning out the storage under the stairs, Ethan opened a dusty old photo box. Most of the pictures were black and white. Leonard as a young man, Margaret in her early nurse's uniform. He sat on the floor, slowly flipping through them, careful with his hands. Then, in a quiet voice, he asked, "Ma'am, how come there's no picture of me with my mom and dad?" Margaret sat down beside him. She didn't answer right away. She picked up a photo from his lap, Leonard standing by a foggy lake, holding a fishing rod, mid-laugh. She looked at it a while. Then she laid a hand gently on his back. "Some pictures don't need to be taken to be remembered," she said. "Like the first morning you were here. Or when you drew the solar system on the pavement." Ethan nodded. He didn't ask again, but he didn't smile either. At the spring festival at school, the children ran forward to give flowers to their parents. Ethan stood a little off to the side, holding a red carnation. Margaret waited at the back of the crowd. He didn't call out to her, just watched, unsure whether he should step forward. She raised her hand, just a small motion. He walked toward her, slow, steady, and offered the flower with both hands. No words. They stood together for a moment, in the noise around them. Margaret squeezed his hand, then placed her arm gently around his shoulder, pulling him close. He leaned into her like someone who had been tired for a long time, but hadn't known where to rest. One night, Margaret awoke without knowing why. Passing his room, she saw the nightlight still on. Ethan was sitting upright on his bed, not crying, not speaking, just sitting, eyes fixed on the dark space between the two windows. "Can't sleep?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He turned to look at her, nodded, then shook his head. She couldn't tell which it was. She didn't ask again. She sat down beside him, resting her hands on his knee. Ethan leaned into her like someone who had been tired for a long time, but hadn't known where to rest. He didn't ask much, but Margaret knew. Inside him was a room with a lock. Not a room meant to keep people out, just a place no one had figured out how to enter. And Margaret didn't go looking for the key. She just stayed near the door, quietly, so that when he was ready to open it, he wouldn't have to do it alone.
The next afternoon, Ethan went looking for the old alarm clock to see if he could fix it. Margaret told him it was in the small storage room behind the house, second shelf from the bottom. The room was dim. Light filtered in through the mesh door just enough to catch the dust floating in the air. Ethan knelt down, pushed past a few cardboard boxes, some old yarn, and a stack of books with cracked spines. In the back corner, he spotted a soft, slightly damp envelope with a bent corner. On the front, faint but legible, was the logo, County Memorial Hospital. He opened it. Inside was a single, thin sheet, fax paper, a provisional birth certificate. Child's name, Ethan, last name left blank. Father, unknown. Mother, unknown. Notes, infant admitted to ER without accompanying adult. Ethan read it 3 times. Each time his eyes stopped at the words unknown. It wasn't unfamiliar, but it had never appeared like this before. Not spoken aloud, not thought in passing. This was official, stamped, dated, archived. He stood up and walked back into the house, the paper unfolded in his hand. Margaret was rinsing vegetables in the kitchen. She looked up at the sound of the door and smiled. "You found it?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He placed the paper on the table without looking at her. "So, who are my parents?" Margaret didn't touch the paper. She dried her hands with the cloth, then pulled out a wooden chair and sat down. It was a while before she spoke. "I don't know any more than what you're holding." Her voice was steady and slow, not evasive, but Ethan could still hear the silence in the middle of her words, like a door that would only open so far and no further. They sat in stillness. No one said anything else. Outside, the sky had begun to gray. Rain was close. Ethan didn't ask again, but for the first time, something like disappointment stirred in him. Not large, not sharp, but just enough to make him rise and walk away before any more words could follow. Margaret looked at the paper still lying on the table, its edges beginning to curl. She didn't put it away. Ethan didn't bring up the paper again, but a few days later, he started searching. At first, it was just a few half-typed phrases. How to find biological parents with no birth record, then deleted. Then another. DNA test services in the US. This time, he clicked the first result. The website opened quietly, with no music, no bright colors. Just a few headings. Order your kit. Send your saliva sample. Get matched with over 10 million users in our system. No names required, no one specific to look for. All it took was for someone else, somewhere, to have sent in a sample too, and the system would match them if the data lined up. Ethan read everything carefully. He didn't ask Margaret. He ordered a kit and had it shipped to a mailbox near school, using only his initials. The sample was sent on a Monday morning. He still went to school, still came home on time, only now his eyes didn't meet hers quite the same way, and his answers grew shorter. 3 weeks later, the email came. You have a level 3 DNA match, likely an uncle, great uncle, or distant cousin. No photo, no full name, just a user ID and a line. Region, near Jacksonville, Florida. Ethan read it over and over again. He didn't know who this person was. Maybe a total stranger, or maybe
someone connected to a part of his life Margaret had never spoken of. He didn't feel excitement or anger, only something like a chill coming in through a tiny crack in the window, not enough to hurt, but enough to change the temperature inside. A missing piece had appeared, but instead of completing the picture, it loosened the shape of everything he thought had been whole. That afternoon, Ethan came down to the kitchen, phone still in hand. Margaret was out by the clothesline, hanging towels in the sun. Light slanted through the fence, catching on the fabric. He stood there for a moment, then asked, almost like he just wanted to make sure, "You really don't know anything more?" Margaret paused. The breeze lifted the towel, then let it fall again. She turned, tilted her face toward him, and spoke slowly. "You don't need to find them to know who you are." It was said with love, every word. But to Ethan, it felt like a box closing, no hinges left to open. He didn't reply, just nodded once and walked back inside. After the talk by the clothesline, Ethan didn't bring it up again, but he began to change, not in any loud or sudden way. No outbursts, no slammed doors, just fewer words, less eye contact. The warmth in his voice no longer lingered. His answers were still polite, but clipped, like someone closing a drawer instead of setting something down. Margaret noticed, not because of anything big, just the space. The kind that grows not from anger, but from something left unresolved for too long. She still watched him leave for school, still folded his shirts, still made dinner like before. But inside, something felt like it was slipping away. Slowly, quietly, and without a clear reason she could name. Once, while folding his laundry, she found a gray shirt she had bought weeks earlier, unworn, untouched. She'd picked it out because he once said he liked that shade. Apparently, he didn't anymore, or never did. One Saturday morning, Margaret came into the kitchen and found a single sheet of paper laid neatly on the table. A printout. Charts, rows of numbers, a logo in the corner from the DNA testing company. No names, no conclusions, just results, unclear, clinical, distant. But the paper itself, being there, in this kitchen they'd shared for years, said enough. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a confrontation. It was just something he wanted her to see. She stood still, the dish towel still in her hand. Morning light came in through the window, slanting across the table. After a while, she folded the paper and placed it in the kitchen drawer. Not hidden, just put away. Ethan didn't ask if she had read it, didn't ask what she thought. But in that silence, both of them understood. Something had shifted. Not a matter of blame or fault, just a different kind of pain. A quiet one. Ethan felt betrayed. Not because she lied, but because the truth had been locked away from him. Margaret, in her heart, believed she had done what was right. She had stayed silent not from fear, but to spare him a wound he didn't need. But sometimes love, even when well meant, can drive people apart if they're no longer looking in the same direction. One afternoon early in 6th grade, the life skills teacher handed each student a blank sheet of paper and a box of colored pencils. On the board, she wrote in big letters, "Family Tree." "Write your name in the center," she said. Then branch out to include your parents, siblings, grandparents. The more complete, the better. Ethan looked down at the paper. He wrote his name first, neatly, the way he always did, then paused. Around him, the classroom had already filled with soft scribbling, lines connecting mothers to fathers to children to grandparents. Some kids added hearts. Others outlined their trees and flowers and loops. Ethan drew one box below his own, Margaret, then stopped again. He didn't know what to draw next, didn't know what shape it should take, didn't know who else to call family. A girl beside him glanced over, braided hair, horse-stitched on her sweatshirt. "You don't have parents?" Ethan shrugged. "I have my grandma." She tilted her head. "I mean your real parents." It wasn't said to be mean, just direct. Still, it landed like the sound of paper tearing, quiet but unmistakable. That evening, Ethan didn't bring up the class assignment. Margaret was in the kitchen baking apple pie, the smell of cinnamon warm and easy in the air. Upstairs, Ethan opened his drawer and took out an old photo, one of him and Margaret at the county fair. He was small, sun-haired, smiling wide. Margaret stood behind him, arm around his shoulder, smiling off toward the camera. Ethan found a pair of scissors and cut the photo in half. He kept the part with his face. The other half he slid behind a book with no title. Later, when Margaret knocked and asked, "Are you hungry?" he answered through the door, "No, ma'am." Same tone as always, not high, not low. After that, Ethan began to quietly collect the questions other people had once asked him and started asking them again himself. Not because Margaret didn't love him, but because he didn't know how to answer in a way that didn't make him feel like someone outside the frame.
Time passed, and the familiar things began to shift, without warning, without sound. Ethan was 13 now, his legs longer, his voice catching slightly at the ends of certain words. But it wasn't the change in height or tone that Margaret noticed most. It was the silence. He still came home on time, still said yes when called, still placed his shoes neatly by the door, hung his jacket where it belonged. But he no longer shared as he once did. His answers had grown shorter, lighter, as though trimmed down to just enough to be polite. "How was school today?" "Fine." "Who did you eat lunch with?" "Friends." "Which friends?" "Just friends." Not sharp, not cold, just shortened. As if he was quietly folding back a page that used to lie open without hesitation. Dinner felt different too. Ethan ate faster now. He barely touched his favorite dishes. When he finished, he stood and said, "I'm going to study," before heading upstairs. Margaret didn't stop him. She looked at the plate he left behind, still half full, then watched his figure disappear down the hallway. The chair across from her still held the shallow imprint from where he'd been. The sound of her spoon against the bowl seemed louder than usual. One evening, she walked to his door, hands still dusted with flour from the bread she was kneading. She knocked lightly. There was a pause. Then his voice came through. Not loud, not harsh. "I'm busy." She didn't reply, just nodded quietly, though no one saw it. None of it was sudden, not loud, not cruel. But Margaret could feel something slipping, soft, like wind through a loose window. Not enough to slam it shut, but just enough to know it was no longer fully closed. The first crack didn't splinter. It didn't shout. It simply
arrived. It was a Saturday afternoon. Ethan said he was going to a group study session. He said he'd be back by 6. Margaret nodded and reminded him, "Take your jacket. It'll be cold by evening." 6:15 came, then 6:30. At 10 to 7, the phone rang. It was Mrs. Clara, another parent from Ethan's school. "The boys are at the arcade near Main Street," she said gently. "I thought you might already know, but just in case." Margaret thanked her and hung up. She didn't call Ethan, didn't text. She went into the kitchen, put the soup away, then brought out the small plate of fruit she'd prepared earlier and set it on the table. She straightened the cloth napkin tucked beneath it. The house was still. Not unusual, but this time it was a different kind of stillness. Like something had dropped without breaking, leaving only the impression of its weight behind. Ethan came home close to 8. He opened the door quietly, slipped off his shoes, backpack hanging loose over one shoulder. "Sorry, we ended up going late," he said, eyes not meeting hers. Margaret nodded. "There's soup in the fridge if you're hungry," she said, voice even, not soft or sharp. He nodded too, then went upstairs. She didn't stop him, didn't follow. The plate of fruits stayed where she left it. No one touched it. One apple slice had started to brown at the edge. Moisture soaked slightly into the napkin underneath. Margaret sat down beside it. Her hand brushed the side of her water glass. It wasn't cold anymore, or warm, just room temperature, like something once held with care, now left to settle. She wasn't angry. It wasn't that. It felt more like the small undoing of something once quiet and strong, like the last button slipping from its thread, not enough to call it broken, but enough to make you stop before stepping out the door. It was late. The light under Ethan's door was still on. The clock in the kitchen read 11:10. Margaret had just finished drying the last glass and set it on the rack. She wasn't looking to argue, just went quietly down the hallway and tapped once on his door. "You should get some sleep," she said, her voice calm. "You've got school in the morning." Inside, the sound of typing paused for a beat, then continued. "Just a little longer," Ethan replied, without turning around. Margaret stood a moment longer, then spoke again, softer this time, almost as if to herself. "I don't want you staying up too late. It's not good for you." It was that second sentence, gentle but perhaps arriving at the wrong moment, that seemed to strike something. Ethan turned toward her quick, his eyes wider than usual, voice rising fast and sharp. "You're not my mother." He didn't wait. He turned back and the door closed. Not slammed, but firm, loud enough. Margaret stood in the hallway a few seconds more, the dish towel still in her hand. She hadn't let it go. She didn't call after him, didn't step forward. She simply turned and walked back toward the kitchen. The light over the sink was still on. The old kettle was half full. She sat down, poured herself a cup, and held the rim gently between both palms, trying to catch what little warmth still remained. She didn't cry. She didn't try not to. She took a small sip, then looked out the kitchen window where the yard had gone dark. The words hadn't been shouted, but they'd landed somewhere deep. Not like earlier silences, those were just space. This one was different. Something had shifted out of place, and she knew it wouldn't settle back the same way again. Still, she didn't pity herself, didn't resent him either. She just sat there, hands around her cup, as if holding something that didn't have a name, not to keep it safe, only to make sure it didn't fall.
That night, Margaret didn't turn off the kitchen light as early as usual. She sat at the small wooden table, one hand resting on a cup of tea that had already gone cold. Half full, no longer warm. She didn't drink the rest, just sat there while the low yellow light drew soft lines across the wood grain and the deeper folds around her eyes, like time speaking in quiet brushstrokes. After a while, she reached for the old leather-bound notebook she kept near the back of the shelf. She didn't write anything long, just a few words without a date. Some things are only learned in silence. Some kinds of love only last when they're not held too tightly. She closed the notebook, set it aside, stood up and rinsed the cup. She turned off the light without glancing down the hallway. She didn't need to. The next morning, she rose early, same as always. Opened the kitchen window, boiled water, made coffee, sliced the apples thin, measured the oats, set 2 bowls, 2 spoons. No more, no less. Ethan came down later than usual. He didn't say good morning, didn't apologize. He sat, ate a few bites, then stood, picked up his backpack. Margaret didn't ask where he was going. She simply watched from her chair, spoon still in hand. When the door closed, the quiet returned, but not the kind they'd once known. She cleared the dishes, washed them, dried them, put them away. No heavier than usual, no lighter. Just what needed to be done, what her hands had done for years. Underneath it all, something waited, not wishful, not demanding, just the space that hadn't closed yet. Because she believed if you hold something long enough, without pulling, without pressing, without asking it to come back, sometimes it will. Ethan entered high school and nothing quite returned to the way it had been. He still did well. Good grades, assignments turned in on time. Teachers liked him. He had friends. But with Margaret, he grew more distant, not loudly, not in rebellion, but in long, quiet stretches that had no name. He still called her ma'am, just as he always had. But now, each time he said it, it sounded like something behind glass, polite enough not to be questioned, cold enough not to be touched. Margaret began to grow used to eating dinner alone. She still cooked for 2, still set the table for both. Ethan rarely came home on time. Some evenings he said there was a group meeting. Other nights he said nothing at all. But every time he came home, he walked lightly, avoided sound, avoided questions. The house grew tidy in a different kind of way, neat, as if whatever affection had once cluttered the corners had now been packed up. What remained was order, the kind that comes when people no longer step into each other's lives. One evening, while dusting the small study, Margaret came across a stack of college scholarship forms. She didn't mean to read them, she only glanced, until her eyes stopped at one section. Parent information. Father's name, unknown. Mother's name, unknown. She placed the forms back exactly as she'd found them. Didn't sigh, didn't tear anything. She sat down on the edge of the bed, holding the cloth in her hand, as if holding still was the only way to keep something from slipping entirely out of reach. Ethan never knew she had seen it, and nothing in his behavior suggested he cared whether she had or not. He lived like someone already grown, full of reasons, full of distance. Enough reasoning to explain himself, enough distance to avoid needing to. Once, near midnight, Margaret heard the car in the driveway. Ethan came in without turning on a light, without saying hello. There was the faintest scent of beer. Not drunk, just not himself. She had still left his dinner out, the porch light still on. She said nothing the next morning. His room was still cleaned every weekend,
The sheets still changed. The windows still cracked open when the sun came in. Not because Margaret didn't notice what was happening, but because she did. Exactly. She just didn't know when or if there was still time to speak of it. Something between them had shifted direction. No argument, no break. Just the quiet packing away of something once known. The way someone folds an old shirt to place it in a box. Margaret didn't try to open that box. She just sat nearby, silent, like someone keeping watch by an unlocked door, hoping one day someone would knock again from the other side.
Ethan started staying out more. At first, it was just late evenings. Then came the excuses: study group, extra practice, a friend's house, even when his backpack hadn't moved from its spot on the floor. Some nights, he simply didn't come home. The next morning, a single text: slept over at James's. Margaret didn't press. She watched the clock move slower than usual, then turned off the porch light just before dawn. One afternoon, the phone rang. It was Ethan's homeroom teacher. Her voice was soft, but tired. He's been suspended for a day. No fighting, just sharp words, hard tone, hard to reach. That evening, Ethan came home. He put away his shoes, washed his hands, sat at the table as if nothing had happened. Margaret said nothing about the call. She simply placed another slice of meat on his plate and poured his water. He lowered his head and ate in silence, as if everything was still intact. Another night, just before 1 a.m., Margaret awoke to the sound of the garage door. Ethan walked in without turning on a light. No greeting, no pause. There was the faint smell of beer on his clothes, his eyes a little red. Not drunk, but not sober either. Margaret sat on the porch with her hands wrapped around a cold cup of tea. He walked past her without a glance. The next morning, breakfast was served for two. Ethan ate slowly. No one mentioned the night before. When Margaret asked gentle questions, Ethan began to answer with logic, cold logic, sharp and thin like a knife. I'm old enough to set my own schedule. I don't have to share everything. You don't always understand. Never rude, but edged just enough to keep her out. One evening, as she was plugging in his phone, something he'd forgotten to charge, Margaret saw a text light up the screen. I don't get how you live with someone like her. She set the phone back exactly where it had been, softly, as if even a breath too loud might break what was already cracked. She didn't mention it, didn't confront. Just another night lying awake, staring at the ceiling in silence. Ethan wasn't storming away. He was slipping, not by noise, but by quiet. Not gone, but unreachable. He stopped letting her know where he was going, stopped letting her know what he needed, stopped letting her know what he felt. And Margaret, who had known him since before he had words, now had to learn how to love him without touching him. No hugs, no bedtime stories, no questions that asked for real answers. Only silence and the soft glow of a monitor light through the crack under his door. Ethan got into college on a late summer morning. He didn't say much. Just placed the acceptance letter on the kitchen table next to Margaret's still warm cup of tea. She glanced at the school name, a city nearly 500 miles away. She didn't ask why he chose somewhere that far. She only said, "If it feels right to you, I'm glad." Ethan nodded, refilled the kettle, and went upstairs. When he left, the leaves were just starting to fall.
The car was packed with books, a few scattered things, and a blanket Margaret had folded for the back seat. He gave her a hug. Quick, not tight. "I'll call," he said, then smiled. A thin smile. Hard to tell if it meant happiness or something else. That first year, he still came home on breaks. The old bus, the old suitcase, the sound of the door unlocking at midnight. Margaret always had hot water ready, fresh towels, the same biscuits he used to like. Ethan ate little, spoke less, then left again. By his second year, he stopped coming back. Once he wrote, "A friend asked me to stay and work over summer." Another time, just, "I'm busy." Margaret kept writing emails. Not many. A line or two, sometimes photos of cats she saw around town, or a picture of toast she'd tried to make the old way again. At first, Ethan replied, short notes. "How are you?" "That looks good." "I'm finishing an assignment." Then came the one-liners. "I'm doing fine. Thanks, Mom." "Hope you're well." His room was still cleaned every week, sheets turned down so they wouldn't go musty. The old pair of sneakers he'd left behind aired out in the sun once a month. No one went inside, except Margaret. At first, she thought, he's just busy. He'll need me again. But time passed like wind over flat land, steady, directionless, quiet. No sign of return, no change of course. One day, she stopped writing. Not because she was hurt, but because there was nothing new left to say. Only old stories, and the person they were meant for no longer seemed to want to hear them. Between them, the distance hadn't come from anger or betrayal. It came from something smaller. The habit of not saying anything at all. And when Ethan would return, eventually, Margaret would still smile. Still set the table. Still have the towels clean. But she wouldn't expect what once was to come back. Because there are years. If you don't go through them together, you can't ever really tell them back to each other. Ethan came home on a June afternoon, just after college graduation. Margaret saw the car pull up while she was watering the plants. The door opened. He stepped out first, taller now, shoulders squared, walking in that quiet, practiced way. He wore a gray suit that fit him well. Beside him was a young woman in a white dress, long brown hair, pulling a wheeled suitcase. "Ma'am," Ethan said. His voice was even, not cold, not warm. Margaret set the watering can down, wiped her hands on her apron. "Hello, dear," she replied. She smiled, slowly, softly, trying to bridge the space between the boy she used to know and the man standing in front of her. They brought the luggage inside. Margaret had already cleaned out the guest room downstairs, once a storage space for winter coats. She'd washed the linens, set out clean towels, placed 2 old ceramic mugs and a few tea bags on the shelf. No one had asked her to, but she had done it anyway. Ashley thanked her, smiling. It was a polite smile, well-rehearsed. Not unfriendly, but her eyes stayed watchful, as if she were standing at the edge of something she wasn't sure she wanted to enter. That evening, Margaret cooked the old favorites, slow-roasted beef, steamed green beans, cornbread from the oven. Ethan ate slowly, not much, glancing up now and then with a half smile. Ashley complimented the food, but her eyes kept moving, from the tablecloth to the wall clock, from the curtains to the chipped plates. Not judging exactly, but measuring. There was something different in the way Ethan spoke. Still correct, still polite, but no longer tender. Each ma'am came out like a formality between acquaintances. No longer the word a boy once whispered while crawling into her lap. Margaret didn't take offense. She simply sat across from him, ate her own portion, and nudged the jar of pickles a little closer to his side of the table. An old habit not quite broken. Inside her, there was no sorrow. Only the quiet sense that something no longer sat in its proper place. Not broken, but no longer joined. A few days after they arrived, on a dim, overcast evening, Ethan sat with Margaret at the kitchen table after dinner. It wasn't raining, but the air felt wet as if it had crept in silently through the old wood of the house. Ashley had gone upstairs to take a call. The kitchen was quiet, just the two of them, the ticking of the clock, the faint scent of dish soap still in the air. "Ma'am," Ethan said, pulling a thin stack of papers from his bag. "There's something I wanted to talk to you about." Margaret set her cup of tea down and leaned in slightly. "I've been looking into some things, property, legal documents," he said. His tone was smooth, careful. "Just to make sure everything is in order for the future, in case anything happens." She looked at him, not suspicious, only a little surprised. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you're healthy now, but we never know what could come up. If something did, I'd be the one handling things. So if I'm listed as a temporary property manager, it'll save time. Just a precaution." Margaret didn't know much about paperwork. Leonard used to take care of those things. Since he passed, nothing had changed. The house stayed in her name. The bills came as they always had. She hadn't added or removed a thing. "I don't know how to read all that," she said, quietly. "It's okay. I've got it handled. You just need to sign here and here. It's really just procedure." She reached for her reading glasses and scanned the page. The font was small, tight, stacked in long rows like boxes drawn across a grid. Ethan had already marked the spots, small red dots, circles, and blue pen. "It's just a formality," he smiled. "There's nothing complicated. We don't even have that much." Margaret didn't ask further, not because she was careless, but because she'd never thought she needed to. To her, Ethan was still the boy who once fell asleep holding a stuffed bear, the one who ate her meals, the one who still said, "Ma'am," each morning when he came down the stairs. She signed 3 times. The pen moved slowly but steadily, blue ink on white paper, her handwriting small and neat. That night, as she washed the dishes, she noticed a trace of fish sauce left on the edge of a bowl. The sharpness of it caught her eyes for a second. She blinked, unsure if it was from the smell or something else. No one brought up the paperwork again. The envelope was taken away the next morning. But something shifted after that. Ethan started calling more often, not to check in, but to clarify small details. And Margaret began to hear in his voice something further away, something she couldn't close with care, something that, if it hadn't come from love, could never be mended by it.
That morning, the sky was overcast, but the light still reached across the old wood floor. Margaret woke early, as always. She boiled water, made tea, placed a slice of toast on a plate, then sat at the table, her cup still full, untouched. The doorbell rang at 8:10, not a time for casual visitors. She rose, walked to the door, and opened it. A man stood on the porch, well-dressed, in a pale blue suit, striped tie, neatly combed hair. He held a stiff envelope in one hand. Not young, not old. The kind of man used to forms and signatures. "Good morning, ma'am. I'm the legal representative, acting under power of attorney for Mr. Ethan James," he said, voice polite, clear. Margaret didn't reply right away. She tilted her head slightly. Her hand still held the cup of tea, fresh from the kitchen. He held out the envelope. "I'm here to deliver a formal notice regarding the transfer of property." A pause. "According to the signed documents dated 3 weeks ago, ownership of this residence has been transferred to Mr. James. We're requesting that you vacate the premises within 10 business days." Margaret stood still. She didn't speak. She didn't step back. She only tilted the cup slightly in her hand. The tea was still warm, its steam fogging the rim. The man waited a moment, then placed the envelope gently on the small table beside the door. "All the details are inside. If you have any questions, feel free to contact our office." He gave a small nod, turned. The silver car idling at the curb reversed slowly and drove off without a sound. Margaret stayed there, cup in hand. No voices in the house. No sound from Ethan. No sign that he was upstairs or anywhere. The house, once familiar with footsteps, the clink of spoons, the creak of a door in the night, now silent, like no one had lived in it that long. She looked at the envelope for a while, didn't touch it, then walked back inside, rinsed her hands, changed into her coat, and left for the market as usual. The errand took longer than it usually did. When she came back, she carried greens, a bottle of milk, and a small box of wrapping paper. No one asked, no one said anything. She began to fold her clothes, one piece at a time. Slowly. The house was so quiet, you could hear the fabric brushing against itself. Margaret began packing the next afternoon. Not much. She took only the essentials. A few folded clothes, a small photo frame of her and Leonard at the old dock, a cloth pouch with her medication, and a worn-out book Ethan had loved as a child, Peter Pan. She didn't touch the living room, didn't open the bookshelf again. The house that once held familiar breath now seemed to speak in someone else's voice. Every corner, every hallway carried a new kind of silence, distant, polite. Even the old staircase, which used to creak under her step, made no sound, as if it too had learned not to disturb. Margaret drove out of the driveway just before 5. The air was cool, the sun came in low. She stopped beneath the big tree in front of the house,
the one that once held Ethan's little swing. The swing was gone, but the hook remained. Rusted, faint, but still there. She didn't look back at the house, only gripped the steering wheel gently, her right hand resting on the small bag by her seat. Inside the car, silence. No radio, no noise, just the soft hum of the air conditioning and her own slow, steady breathing. No tears, no curses, only a new kind of emptiness, not loud, but deep. Margaret didn't try to remember, didn't ask herself why. She simply sat there for a while, before placing her hand on the gear shift and driving away from the place she had called home, not for a season, but for life.
The car was parked beneath an old tree behind a small-town grocery store, just far enough from the street to be left alone. That was home now. The windshield held a soft layer of dew that blurred the blinking streetlights like they were trying to disappear. Margaret slept curled toward the door, her shoulder pressed lightly to the cold window, arms wrapped around a canvas bag the way someone might hold a child or a memory. Her scarf, a knitted one, old and thinning, didn't do much against the draft coming in from the cracked window. Her shadow on the glass looked like a woman waiting. For what? No one could say. Inside, the car smelled faintly of warm plastic and paper. Flyers she had collected from the corner market now lined under the seat to soften the night. Every evening she straightened them, smoothed them with care. As if order could offer comfort or dignity. Sounds passed by, a horn in the distance, the whir of tires on asphalt, a dog barking briefly, then going quiet. Once, headlights swept the inside of the car and woke her for a moment. She blinked, but didn't sit up, just closed her eyes again, not out of tiredness, but habit. At dawn, Margaret stepped out quietly, the bag slung over her shoulder. She walked to the old clinic a few blocks down. The public tap still worked, barely. She cupped water to her face, then crossed the street to the gas station to use the restroom. She didn't speak. No one did. It made things easier. Her movements were practiced, almost invisible. She knew how to live without spectacle. She tied her hair back, tucked in her shirt, wiped her hands on a clean cloth folded in her coat pocket. These were the things she could still control. She didn't complain, didn't pity herself. In the rare moments she looked at her reflection in the rearview mirror, there was no self-reproach, just a steady quiet. Not defeat, something more like resolve. She stayed clean. Her bag was neatly packed. Her steps were sure. No one noticed, but if they had, and they looked long enough, they might have seen it. In the quiet way Margaret moved through those mornings, there was no collapse. There was only the beginning of something else, something no one had expected. That night, there was no rain, but the cold cut deep. Margaret lay curled in the driver's seat, cushioned by old sweaters. She couldn't sleep. Her eyes stayed open in the dark, seeing nothing clearly, only aware of her own breath echoing quietly inside the small car. She thought of Leonard, not in full memories, but in fragments, quietly returning, footsteps on old wood, the smell of coffee just before it cools. That morning, the morning Leonard died, had started like any other. The air was crisp, the kitchen lamp glowed yellow, the wall clock ticked in its usual rhythm. Margaret got up early, intending to wake him for breakfast. She called his name once. No answer. Again, still quiet. She stepped into the room. He was on the floor, on his side, one hand close to his chest, eyes shut like he meant to open them and say something,
but didn't get the chance. Margaret called for an ambulance. A young paramedic arrived first, then a stretcher, then quiet apologies. Everything happened quickly, efficiently, without noise, as if they were used to scenes like this, and she was expected to be. Leonard's funeral was held on a bright morning. She chose a small chapel, wood-paneled, low-ceilinged. Not many people came, but those who did greeted her with a quiet gaze. Not pity, just a kind of silent respect. There weren't many flowers, just a few pots of white chrysanthemums placed beside his photo, the one where he wore a pale blue shirt and smiled gently, not too wide, like he was about to ask, "What are we having today?" No one knew she stayed in that chapel long after everyone had gone. No one knew that from that day on, Margaret stopped listening to the radio in the mornings, stopped playing music while she cooked, stopped setting out a second cup of coffee. Loss didn't arrive like a storm. It came like a shadow and stayed. It sat beside her through the seasons, through the years, never loud, but never leaving. Margaret switched on the ceiling light inside the car, a dim yellow glow spreading over the dusty dashboard. She opened the glove box beside the seat and pulled out an old fabric suitcase with fraying handles. Beneath a folded cloak and a few plastic bags of dry food, there was a gray envelope. No name, only a faint embossed seal from the Georgia State Court. She placed it on her lap and opened it slowly. Inside was a copy of a court ruling, a civil suit against the hospital where Leonard had once been admitted. Medical negligence, resulting in wrongful death due to delayed treatment, the document stated. At the bottom, in bold print, compensation awarded, $9,900,000. Margaret hadn't cried when she received that ruling 3 years earlier. She hadn't told anyone. That day she went to the bank, opened a new account under her maiden name, Margaret Louise Enders, and transferred the entire amount into it. She never touched it, never used it. Just knew it was there. Not for spending, but like something left behind from what once was, and was lost. Ethan didn't know. She hadn't told him. Maybe because she knew, if he ever found out, the way he looked at her might change. A part of her didn't want to be the one who kept something hidden, but she also didn't want to be seen as a victim who got paid. Money couldn't bring Leonard back. It couldn't fill the silence in a kitchen where laughter used to live. But it was there, quiet, like a witness. That night, Margaret placed the envelope back in the suitcase, zipped it shut, and turned off the car light. She leaned her head against the window. Some secrets aren't kept out of fear, but to keep something from being taken. Some things don't need to be said, not because they aren't true, but because if someone truly understood, they wouldn't need an explanation. Margaret sat in her car as the last light of day pulled back from the distant ridge. She didn't turn on the cabin light. On her lap was an old cloth-bound notebook, pale green cover, corners worn thin, the kind people used to write down phone numbers and doctor appointments. She flicked through the pages slowly, familiar handwriting, most names no longer in use. On the 8th page, a slanted line of text. Clarence Ford, 706-228, Old House, Greenwood. Next to it, a note in red ink. Leonard's friend, lawyer, retired. Margaret rested her hand on the book. She didn't dial, not yet. She just let it sit there a while, as if she were tracing memories instead of reaching out. She thought about Ethan who had betrayed her. The way he signed his name, the way he spoke, the way he avoided her eyes. She had seen the signs stacked together like a map folded the wrong way, unclear but unmistakably wrong. She wasn't sure what she was more angry about, losing the house or realizing she had trusted so completely that she hadn't prepared for the blow. Then she thought of Clarence. Back when Leonard was still alive, Clarence was the only one who could argue with him without losing ground. A sharp mind, a smoker's voice, but always gentle when speaking to women. When Leonard passed, Clarence had been the first to show up. He didn't say much, just laid a hand on her shoulder, then poured 2 glasses of bourbon. Today's not for reasoning. Just sit. And they did. Into the night. No talk of laws, just cats, and the sound of autumn wind through the porch screens. They hadn't seen each other since. Clarence had moved to a small cabin 3 hours outside the city. Grew pears, dried apples, didn't bother with the internet. Margaret had kept his number out of habit more than intention, partly for Leonard, partly because she knew if there ever came a day she needed real clarity, honest, piercing clarity, Clarence was the only one who could offer it without asking, "Why now?" She picked up the phone, dialed the number, paused before the last digit. An inside voice said, "Should I really drag him back into this after all these years?" Then another breath rose in her, short but steady. If there's one person who deserves to know the truth, it's Clarence. She pressed the call button. 4 rings. Then a deep, gravelly voice, unmistakable. "Clarence here." She stayed quiet for a half second, then said softly, "It's me, Margaret." There was another pause. Then he said, "Well, I'll be damned. How many years has it been, Margaret?" No small talk, no catching up. She just answered, "It's been a long time." Clarence first thought the call was just a hello, an old voice from a time long gone, maybe looking to remember something soft and fading. But when he heard Margaret's tone, low, steady, stripped of pleasantries, he sat up straighter in his chair. His hand moved almost instinctively toward a pen. Something in her voice told him this wasn't a memory. It was a decision. She said the name first. Ethan. Clarence stilled. "Go on," he said. Margaret spoke slowly, no drama, just facts. Ethan had asked her to sign a set of papers, told her it was for ease of managing things later. She hadn't read them closely. She had trusted him. Clarence's mind moved faster than his hand could keep up. "Do you still have the documents?" "I made copies," she said. "They're in the car." He nodded silently, not that she could see it, but because his body remembered the rhythm of listening like this, tracking language for traps, truth for shape. "Tell me everything," he said. "From the moment he brought it up, every word you remember." Margaret went back, step by step. Clarence asked short questions, sharp, precise. "Where did you sign? Anyone else present? Did he mention inheritance clauses? Was there a witness? Whose name was on the deed before?" Each answer landed in his mind like a piece on the chessboard. Something wasn't right. It didn't fit. Not legally, not morally. Then she said, almost as an afterthought, "I was asked to leave. A lawyer came. Said Ethan had the authority." Clarence's pen stopped moving. "No," he said. "That's not how it works. Not without more." He opened a drawer, found an old folder still labeled in his handwriting. Statutes, case notes, a few business cards from people who hadn't yet retired. His hand rested on the list. The weight of it brought back something he didn't expect to feel again. "I'm not your lawyer anymore, but I still know the ones who are worth calling." On the other end, Margaret said nothing, but he could hear her breathing. Not shaky, just deep, like someone who has stopped floating and decided to touch bottom again. Start by sending me what you've got. Every page. No hurry, but no delay either. There was a pause. Then Margaret spoke. You always knew how to stay calm, she said. This isn't calm. It's tired of watching people get away with things. A small pause again. Then her voice came, quiet, but solid. This time, she said, I won't let it pass. Clarence let the silence sit a second longer. Then we begin. The hearing took place on a Tuesday morning. The air was mild, a breeze slipping through the window slats, making the curtains stir like someone quietly exhaling. Clarence stood before the court, shoulders slightly stooped, but his eyes still clear. He wore a white shirt with a frayed collar, his tie tight, and the case file tucked neatly under one arm. No one had asked him to be here. He was no longer a practicing attorney. There was nothing left to prove, but he came anyway. The courtroom was small, with a low ceiling and old wooden benches. A morning without rain. Light filtered softly through mesh curtains, giving the room the hush of a chapel. Clarence scanned the room. No Ethan, no Ashley, only Margaret, seated on the back bench, an old gray coat, a canvas bag on her lap, her hand resting on the strap, unmoving, as if anchoring herself to the last thread of composure. Clarence gave her a small nod. Margaret didn't smile, just nodded back, barely, but enough. Enough to say, we're still on the same side. He looked up to the judge's bench, then at the wooden panel behind it, gold letters chipped at the edges, but still legible. In God we trust. And somewhere in his mind, an old memory stirred, slow and persistent. Leonard sitting across from him with a glass of bourbon in hand, half grinning. Life is never cheaper than when you're in a hospital. They had both laughed, then gone quiet, then sat together for a long time, like men who knew they were powerless against justice, but still unwilling to let it disappear entirely. Clarence thought of that as he stepped to the witness stand and placed his hand on the sheet of affirmation. Not because he was young, not because he was better than anyone else, but because some things should not be lost, not even after hope has gone quiet. And today, he wasn't standing here for the law. He stood here for an old woman who had been betrayed, but still didn't let go, for a friend who was gone, and for himself to remember that sometimes, even late, you can still do the right thing. A clerk entered with a thin manila folder and handed it to Margaret's attorney. He stood, opened the top pages, and addressed the judge calmly. Your Honor, he said, the defendants, Mr. Ethan James and Ms. Ashley Walters, have left the state. Their current address is unknown. They have not responded to the summons. The courtroom was still. No one looked surprised. Clarence read the photocopied notice slowly, then folded it neatly and set it down. He didn't sigh, just gave a faint shake of the head, the kind a man makes when he's seen something like this before. No spine, he murmured. Can't even face an old woman. Margaret sat in the back row motionless. She reached to smooth the hem of her coat, pressed a hand along one sleeve. Not because she was cold, more like she was steadying herself, making sure she was still intact. She said nothing, didn't flinch, didn't even blink. There was no anger, no surprise, not even disappointment. Just a quiet that had settled into her over time, now folding in one more silence. No one in the courtroom said Ethan's name again after that. And no one asked Margaret what she thought, because it was clear. She had already lived through the worst of it. Not the betrayal itself, but the part where someone no longer has the courage to stand and look you in the eye afterward. The trial began on a Thursday morning in a small courtroom in the county courthouse. No cameras, no reporters, just a few people present, an older judge, a clerk typing slowly, and the plaintiff's side, Margaret, Clarence, and a young attorney. Margaret sat at the end of the table, saying nothing. She listened. Her eyes stayed fixed on the pages being turned in front of the judge. The lawyer stood, holding a file. He spoke calmly, clearly. This is evidence of contract fraud, improper transfer of property under the guise of care authorization used to secure full ownership. He placed the signed papers on the bench, Ethan's signature, side by side with legal statutes about guardianship and fiduciary duty. Clarence had prepared each section carefully. There was no embellishment, no drama. The clerk's keyboard clicked quietly, like soft rain on a roof. No one from the defendant's side replied. No one rose to argue. No representative appeared. No written objection had been submitted. Just black ink on white paper, and a truth that needed no defense, only to be read aloud. Margaret didn't shift in her seat. Her hands rested in her lap. She didn't smile, didn't bow her head. She looked like someone who had simply arrived, not in victory, but in quiet endurance. The trial ended in under 30 minutes. No applause, no tears. But when the judge finally said, "This court recognizes Margaret Enders as the rightful owner of the property," something in the room lifted, like a weight quietly removed. Margaret stood. She nodded once, not to anyone in particular, but to the space she'd held. Clarence placed a hand on her back as they walked out. Neither of them said a word, but in the quiet rhythm of her steps, something had been put back in place. Not just the house, but something steadier, something like faith. Margaret didn't return to the house right after the trial. She went back to a rented room instead, a small place beside a gas station 10 miles outside the city. Narrow bed, a yellowed lamp by the sink, foil wallpaper peeling at the corners. The clerk didn't ask for much. She didn't give her real name, just paid by the week. 3 weeks passed. Then, one clear afternoon, Margaret came back. The sky was pale and open. Threads of silver cloud stretched thin above the hills. She pulled up to the gate and cut the engine, but kept her hands on the wheel. A soft breeze slipped through the cracked window, carrying the scent of earth, familiar, a little damp. The house stood where it always had. The iron gate rusted at the hinge. The stone steps streaked with moss. Dust clung to the eaves. On the window handle, a faded ribbon still hung. Ethan used to fidget with it while waiting for dinner, but now no one was there. No footsteps. No light spilling from the kitchen. The house was still, as if holding its breath to see what she might do. She stepped out. Her canvas shoes made a dry sound on the gravel path. She stood at the gate, one hand resting on the metal bar. It felt cold, rough. She took a long breath and moved no further. This had been her place, where she brewed coffee each morning, listened to the radio hum, wiped dust from the shelves in the corners of the windows. Leonard used to sit on the porch reading the paper. Ethan once drew suns in colored chalk on the fence out back. Each brick, each window frame, still holding fragments of her time. But now it felt like a set. Everything where it had been, but no life behind it. She looked in through the window. The living room was dark. The old curtains had been replaced by something beige. The furniture had shifted. One of my armchairs was gone. Strange, she thought. She had reclaimed it all. Documents, deed, even the keys. And yet, standing here, It no longer felt like a place she could return to. Her hand slipped from the iron gate. She didn't open it. She didn't step inside. Some things are won back not to be kept, but to prove you were brave enough to fight and wise enough to walk away. She went back to the car. Didn't turn the engine right away, just sat there, looking through the glass one last time. The old house did not look back, and she wasn't waiting for it to. The window was rolled halfway down, letting in just enough air to stir the edge of the cloth draped over the steering wheel. Afternoon light slid across her shoulder and touched the door handle in a soft angle. There was nothing clear about it. Memory came in no order, and without permission, it arrived the way dust returns after cleaning. She saw Ethan being handed to her for the first time, wrapped in a faded blue blanket. The social worker placed him in her arms and simply said, "Take good care of him." He was asleep. His tiny hand curled loosely around the blanket's seam. Margaret said nothing. She just looked down, then nodded, quietly, as if what was asked had already been decided. Another time surfaced. His voice, sharp like fabric tearing. "You're not my mother." It was an old sentence, but the tone of it still sounded close, as if spoken that very morning. Some memories came gentler. The two of them at the kitchen table, sharing the last orange of the season. The peel dry and stubborn, Ethan handed her one small segment, a little sour. She took it, without a word, then gave him the rest. And Leonard, standing under the porch roof, holding an unlit cigarette. He used to do that when thinking. Never lit it, just held it, resting between his lips like an excuse to stay quiet longer. Crumbs from breakfast still on his shirt. She didn't mention them, didn't brush them off. There was no border between what was lovely and what hurt. They folded into one another like music without melody, without theme. But they were there, fully, as if those very pieces had carved her name into every brick and step of that house. Margaret didn't cry. She didn't try to push the memories away, didn't try to hold them close. She just sat still and let them pass through her, like water that didn't stop but wasn't cold either. Some things don't need sequence, don't need explaining. They remain, not to be understood, but simply to be known. That they happened, and that she lived through them. Margaret started the car and pulled away from the old house. The tires moved slowly. The evening wind slipped past her shoulder, drifted in through the window she hadn't rolled up all the way. She didn't look back. On the way, she stopped at a familiar gas station and bought a paper cup of coffee with a splash of milk. It wasn't hot, but she held onto it for the rest of the drive, something to fill her hand. The motel room was as quiet as she left it. The curtains were drawn. Early evening light spilled through a narrow gap, just enough to reach the edge of the wooden desk against the wall. She opened her laptop, waited for the screen to glow. The keyboard creaked a little under her fingers. Margaret typed each word slowly, without stopping. For sale. West Side home. 3 bedrooms, small yard, near schools. Full title, no liens. Listings loaded. She scanned them. No surprise, no hesitation. Then she picked up her phone, searched her contacts for Clarence, pressed call. His voice came after 2 rings, low, familiar. Hello? Margaret didn't waste words. "I want to sell the house," she said. "Can you help?" A pause on the line. Then Clarence replied, calm and steady, "Yes." She said nothing more. Didn't mention Ethan, didn't bring up the past. Just set the phone down, opened the drawer, and took out a thin plastic folder. Inside, the deed, the papers, complete, in order, as if she'd known all along this moment would come. Margaret placed it neatly on the desk. She took nothing from that house. No photos, no keepsakes, only documents and the quiet decision that had been ripening for some time. There are doors that, once walked through, shouldn't be reopened just to stand and look. Then she closed the laptop, sat still as darkness eased into the room. No regret, no sorrow, only one thing clear. Tomorrow would not be yesterday. And this time, she had chosen.
Margaret left Georgia on a pale morning. The sky was dry, but held the color of ash, and the ground still felt soft with last night's dew. She sat in the car for nearly an hour before turning the key, not from hesitation, but to be certain she was ready. She drove roads without clear names, following only a few handwritten notes folded in her coat pocket. Not toward the city. She chose Mississippi, a small town where no one knew she had once stood in a courtroom, once had a family, once lost it. A place where no one asked about the past. The town was small enough to notice. No movie theater, just a pharmacy, a grocery store, and a real estate office tucked between a bakery and a barber shop. She stepped in and said simply, "I need 3 old houses. Nothing large, just close together, with some land." The agent, a middle-aged man with a soft southern accent, looked puzzled but didn't ask much. He took her to the edge of Magnolia Drive, to 3 vacant homes that hadn't been touched in nearly 2 years. The walls were stained, roofs peeling, backyards tangled in weeds. But the foundations held, and each kitchen door opened toward the morning sun. Margaret nodded. "I'll take all 3. She paid by wire. No negotiations, no legal advice. Renovation began a few days later. No contractors, just Margaret, holding a wire brush, a pail of water, peeling wallpaper in slow strips, sanding old doors until they were smooth again. She repainted them pale white. She planted lavender along the fences, mixed soil with her bare hands. Dirt and sweat clung to her sleeves. The first kitchen she restored was painted a soft yellow with a window that looked out on a low hedge of roses. She told no one. No ad in the paper, no open letters. Just the work, one piece at a time, as if it had always been meant, though no plan had ever existed. A neighbor once asked, "What are you opening here?" "I'm not opening anything," Margaret said, her voice steady. "I just want to make a place ready for those who think there's nowhere left to return to." The 3 houses were nearly finished. Lights had been installed, beds made with fresh linens, but Margaret still rose early, opening each door in turn, then closing it again. No one came. There was no kettle whistling, no chair scraping back from a table. A porch, no matter how well built, couldn't be called a home if no one came to rest beneath it. One morning, she put on a heavy cloth coat, slipped a few folded papers into her pocket, and drove to the local church. After that, the community health clinic, where people came for their blood pressure or to receive a lunch that didn't ask for names. She didn't linger, didn't ask questions. She waited. She didn't choose the person who looked most in need. She chose the one who no longer believed help would ever come. Alma was the first, a widow in her 60s, living in the shell of an old pickup behind a relative's house. Her son had cut off contact 2 years before. Margaret found her waiting quietly at the clinic,
seated near the weighing scale. There wasn't much conversation, only a question. Would you like a place to stay? No forms, no explaining. Alma looked up, said nothing. Margaret held out a key. The far left house. There's hot water, a gas stove, the bed's already made. Darlene came next. Thin, her skin lined from years of motel night shifts. She'd lived with her daughter once, then been asked to leave after some old mistake no one cared to name anymore. Margaret saw her buying instant coffee at the corner store. "Do you cook?" Margaret asked. Darlene gave a half smile, didn't answer. Margaret handed her a key. "Middle house. There's a pot in the kitchen, but no frying pan." No one asked Margaret why she was doing any of this. They accepted the keys, looked at one another, then at her. Not tearful, just a quiet nod, as if what they'd been given wasn't shelter, but a stretch of silence where no one asked too much. Margaret didn't explain. She only stepped back when they stepped forward, as if she had only been there to keep the light on until someone arrived. 3 weeks after Alma and Darlene had moved in, Margaret went to the county office to file the paperwork. She carried a slim folder, neatly filled, every field already typed or written in careful script. Name of representative, Margaret Louise Enders. Just below, a blank line, organization name. She paused there. The pen hovered, not because she didn't know what to write, but because she needed a second to be sure, really sure, that she was ready to let the name live on in something new. She wrote L.J. Haven. That afternoon, as Margaret watered a patch of mint behind the middle house, Alma sat on the porch steps, a letter in hand. She had picked it up from the shared mailbox, tucked inside a plain envelope. L.J. Haven, she read aloud, then turned slightly. "Does the name mean something, Margaret?" Margaret didn't look up right away. The wind moved the kitchen curtain, light and slow as if listening too. She smiled. "Just initials," she said, "of someone I trusted a long time ago." No one asked further, and no one needed to. There was never a sign put up. Just 3 quiet houses with pale walls and white curtains, and kitchen doors that stayed unlocked most days. Now and then, someone would walk up and ask, "Is this place taken?" The answer was always the same. If you need it, it's yours. A name is a way to remember, but a place like this didn't need to be remembered loudly. It only needed to be lived in, softly, honestly, and for as long as someone needed a roof and no questions. Late in the day, in the kitchen of the middle house, Margaret set a pot of stew on the gas burner. The smell of chicken, white beans, and a bit of beetroot drifted into the corners of the room. Outside, Alma was rearranging a few lavender pots that had been knocked over by the morning rain. Darlene wiped the table with the dry cloth. Old wood, a few thin cracks, but clean. Evening settled in. No one turned on the lights right away. The lies of the daylight came through the window above the sink, sliding across the table, touching 3 chairs that didn't match. Margaret ladled soup into bowls. Alma tore pieces of bread. Darlene laid out spoons and folded napkins. They didn't talk much. Now and then someone would ask, "Where's the salt?" or "Anyone need another spoon?" No one laughed out loud, but in their eyes there was something warm, not loud, not certain, but present in a way it hadn't been for some time. Margaret poured the tea slowly, carefully. When they were all seated, she set the pot down and said softly, "We're not going to call this a shelter. We're going to call it home." No one answered, but there was no need to. Only the sounds of spoons touching porcelain and a soft wind brushing past the porch, as if the house itself had exhaled after all those empty years. After the first supper, nothing changed right away, but the kitchen stayed warm each evening, lights still came on before 6 a.m., and then, from somewhere, people began to arrive. No one knew how they heard. Maybe a nurse at the clinic mentioned it quietly. Maybe someone who'd once passed through said something to a friend on the bus ride home. They came slowly, not in groups. One near the start of the week, one closer to the end of the month. No one brought much. A worn canvas bag, a folded set of clothes, a medical slip with a return date. But they all carried the same look in their eyes, not expecting help anymore and still coming. Margaret wasn't surprised. She simply laid out more sheets, stacked another spoon, slid an extra mattress near the wall. She didn't ask for full names. She didn't ask for reasons. If you need something, she'd say, just ask, then fall quiet. The only question asked, over and over, in that place, was, did you sleep all right last night? And the answers didn't need to be proper. Better than I have in years. Not bad. Maybe because someone boiled water before the sun came up. In time, all three houses filled. But they weren't crowded. They weren't loud. Just steady. Like breathing. Margaret knew she was no longer the one who'd been betrayed. She was the one with the keys. The one who kept the kettle warm, the doors unlocked, and the quiet steady enough that someone else might dare to sit down. It was a quiet weekend evening. Rain tapped gently on the porch roof. Dinner had been late. Someone new had arrived that day, still adjusting to the rhythm of the house. Margaret was putting the soup pot back on the stove when a soft voice came from the table. "Mama Margaret, can I pour the tea for you?" The words landed without fanfare. No one laughed. There was a moment of stillness. Margaret paused, the ladle still in her hand. She didn't turn around right away. Then she gave a small nod. "All right." No one corrected the name, and she didn't either. After that, the name Mama began to appear, softly, without discussion. It wasn't something decided. It simply settled into the house the way warm air settles at dusk. "Mama, where's the spoon gone?" "Mama, will you eat with us tonight?" "Mama, do you think this sweater's warm enough?" Margaret didn't speak much in return. She sewed sleeves when someone tore theirs, steeped ginger when a cough lingered, filled thermoses before bed, wiped the counter before the first footstep came through in the morning. She didn't speak of love. She didn't use the word family. But the way she laid a hand on someone's back, the way she folded dish towels just so, each gesture said something close to belonging, without the need to name it. No one could say when it began, and no one needed to. Only Margaret, some mornings, would wake before the sun, sit at the edge of the kitchen with a warm cup between her palms, and think quietly, maybe this time I'm not alone anymore. The rain hadn't stopped. It came steady, without wind, without fuss. In the middle house, they gathered around the old wooden table. The yellow light fell gently against the walls. An old laptop sat on a low stool, tilted just enough for everyone to see. It was a black and white film, grainy picture, the sound occasionally crackling. No one complained. Someone brought popcorn from the kitchen, split into 3 plastic bowls. One woman sat on a chair, another on the floor, her head resting on someone's knee like they'd known each other far longer than they had. Margaret sat on the edge of a chair, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea gone cold. She said nothing, just watched. The film reached a scene where an old man tripped over a bucket. Silly, harmless. Someone let out a quiet laugh. Then another joined in. The laughter spread slowly, like small waves nudging the edges of chairs, of knees, of silence. And Margaret laughed too, not loudly, just a small sound, released without planning. Alma turned, gently took her hand and said, like sharing a secret, "It's been a while since we heard you laugh like that." Margaret didn't look over. She kept her eyes on the screen, her gaze soft in the low light, and gave a small, steady nod. No one said anything more. But something in her, something quiet and long locked away, loosened itself, without force, without tears. It was just a small laugh, not because of joy, but because, at last, it didn't come with pain.
The morning brought no rain, but no sunlight either. The ginger tea had been simmering since early, steam rising softly above the stove. Alma sat at the corner of the table, a small radio beside the potted lavender. The signal crackled, the voice coming in and out, but just enough to catch the words. Ashley M. was arrested yesterday in Baton Rouge, connected to a minor financial fraud case. The suspected accomplice was not present, believed to have fled the state. Ethan's name wasn't mentioned clearly, just a vague reference, a male suspect with prior civil litigation in Georgia, current whereabouts unknown. Alma glanced over at Margaret, brows pinched just slightly, but said nothing. Margaret poured more water into the teapot, her movements slow, unbothered. She set the kettle down, wiped the edge of her cup, and folded the small cloth on the table. No visible reaction, not a single word, just a breath, a little longer than usual, a blink that didn't land on anything. Margaret stood, opened the back door. The smell of damp soil drifted in from the garden. She stepped outside, a few quiet steps, and looked up at the clothesline where Darlene had hung 2 old dish towels. The breeze was gentle. The news had arrived like a draft through the room, not strong enough to swing open the door, only enough to lift the corner of a curtain already tied down. Margaret asked nothing, said nothing for the rest of the day. The old wound no longer ached, only a soft hum remained, like a scar that has long healed, still there, still part of her, but needing no further mention.
It was late autumn, the air still, the sky full of clouds that looked heavier than they felt. Margaret was out by the lavender beds when she heard a knock, 3 soft raps on the gate. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked slowly toward the sound. A young woman stood outside, backpack slung over one shoulder, sleeves pushed to her elbows. Her shoes were dusty, hair tied back without much care. "I'm not asking for much," the girl said. "Someone told me there's a place here where people can rest a while before moving on." Margaret looked at her, calmly, kindly. She didn't ask where the girl had come from or why. "There's a room left," Margaret said. "If you need to wash your clothes, there's a line out back." The girl nodded once. "Thank you." That evening, the middle house smelled of soup and fried corn batter. Alma stirred the pot, Darlene set extra bowls, Margaret added 1 more spoon, 1 more folded napkin. The girl sat at the far end of the table. She ate quietly, said little. It wasn't until Alma asked, gently, "Where are you from, honey?" That she spoke again. "Georgia," the girl said. Then after a pause, "I used to know someone named Ethan a while ago." There was a slight shift in the room, a flicker in Alma's eyes. Margaret didn't turn. She simply placed the lid back on the teapot, slowly and with care. No one asked more. The girl didn't explain. The moment passed like a shadow on the wall, noticed, then gone. Later, after the dishes had been cleared and the others drifted off to their rooms, Margaret stayed behind, wiped the table, folded the cloth, stacked the cups just so. She didn't speak of the name, didn't carry it into the next day, but something in her had softened, just enough. Not forgiveness, not forgetting, just the quiet release of something she no longer needed to hold. After dinner, the kitchen lights stayed warm while the dishes dried on the rack. Alma sat at the small table with Margaret, both holding cups of warm tea. Outside, the wind moved gently through the lavender along the fence. Alma looked sideways, voice soft. "You don't want to know more?" Margaret didn't answer right away. She stirred her tea once, then let the spoon rest in the cup. "Not every story needs to be dug back up," she said finally, almost like she was speaking to the steam rather than to Alma. No bitterness in her voice, no curiosity either, just a kind of ease that had taken a long time to earn. She passed Alma a piece of mild sweetbread, soft, still warm from the afternoon. Neither of them spoke for a while. The quiet wasn't tense. It settled around them like a familiar shawl, a kind of stillness that didn't need to explain itself. Margaret leaned back slightly, sipped her tea, eyes calm. Some answers, she knew by now, came best when left unspoken. A few weeks after the young woman arrived, life at LJ Haven continued as usual. Light still came on at 5. The kitchen stayed warm. Nothing changed, not in any obvious way. Until one late afternoon. The light faded earlier than usual. No rain, but the cold had begun to seep through the window frames. Margaret put on a light coat, brushed her hair back behind one ear, an old habit, and stepped onto the porch. She walked slowly along the stone path toward the weathered wooden mailbox by the fence. The latch gave a soft creak. Inside was a single envelope, thin, no name, a stamp from somewhere distant, another state, unfamiliar. The glue at the edge had bled a little. The paper was creased. Margaret stood still for a moment. There was no rush, nothing urgent. She carried the envelope back, not in her hand, but tucked between the pages of her old notebook, like something to be read later. In the kitchen, water had already boiled. She poured tea into a porcelain pot, added a few thin slices of ginger, then sat down by the table. Light from the window fell across the tabletop, catching the back of her hand, a few stray silver hairs near her temple. She picked up the letter opener, slid it along the seam the way one might open a line of old stitches. The paper gave a soft sound, no tear, just a pale crease where it came apart. Margaret didn't read it right away. She lifted her teacup, took a small sip, and set it back down. Her hand rested on the envelope, then opened it. Not fast, not slow, not hurried, not hesitant. The first line leaned slightly to the left. Black ink, ballpoint pen. The letters were even, small, a little tight, like the writer had been holding his hand too firmly, trying not to let it shake. Margaret didn't need more than 3 words to know. It was Ethan. There was no name at the top, no dear, no greeting. Only one line to begin. I'm not asking for forgiveness. No explanations. No excuses. He didn't use words like because or why, just a plain recounting. Each act, each lie, like reading himself back to a courtroom where no one was sitting in judgment. I changed the dates in the documents. I hid the letters from the lawyer. I kept the keys without saying a word. I knew I was wrong from the start, but I kept going because I was scared, because I wanted to hold on to something that was never mine. Some places had been scratched out, the paper thinned where the ink had been scraped away, as if his hand had stopped, then tried again, then stopped once more. Near the end, the handwriting shifted. It pressed deeper, tilted off balance. I know I don't deserve to be your son, but I need you to know not a day has passed without me thinking of the way you looked at me that day. No second apology, no request to meet, no return address. Just a single letter signed at the bottom. Unclear, but Margaret didn't need it to be clear. She read to the end in silence. Her eyes stayed fixed on the last word long after it was done. One hand rested gently on the page, lightly, as if folding it too soon might crease what had just been said. No one in the house knew she'd received a letter that afternoon, and Margaret didn't say anything about it. Only the wind outside the window, the scent of ginger tea still warm, and a quiet that didn't sting, only slowed her heart just enough to let it settle. That evening, the middle house was quieter than usual. Supper was early. Tea was steeped. The dish towels hung straight on the backs of chairs. When someone asked if Margaret wanted another biscuit, she simply nodded and said, "Later." Upstairs, her room was unchanged. A soft yellow lamp, a book face down on the nightstand, and the letter, already read, resting on the table, untouched since. She sat at the edge of the bed. Her eyes didn't settle on anything in particular, just a stillness, like what comes after rain. Then, slowly, Margaret picked up the letter. She didn't read it again, didn't glance at the last line. She folded it once, along the same crease. Her hand found it without effort, as if memory had already memorized the fold. Opening the drawer beside the bed, she reached for a worn Bible. Not one she read every day, but one she had always kept close. She slid the letter between two pages, no bookmark, no corner bent, then closed the book gently, like setting down something fragile. No one in the house asked what she'd read, and Margaret didn't tell. That night, as Alma passed the hallway, she saw the light still on, and Darlene, rinsing cups in the kitchen, thought she heard slow, steady steps overhead. Not hurried, not heavy, like someone walking with something just laid to rest. Before sleep, Margaret rose and drew the curtain back. Outside, the small garden was quiet in mist, the lavender swaying faintly. She smiled, not for any clear reason, but some smiles don't need explaining, because once something is folded back along the right crease, it no longer carries the weight it used to. A light rain was falling that morning, steady, windless, just enough to wet the porch roof and leave a thin film of water along the window ledge. Margaret and Alma sat in the kitchen. The light wasn't on. The soft gray from the window was enough to see the peelings piling in the aluminum bowl. Margaret leaned forward, scraping a large potato. Her hands were steady, slow, She spoke without turning. "You remember Mrs. Birdie used to live next door to me? Her husband betrayed her for 20 years. When he got sick, couldn't move anymore, she took care of him, fed him, turned him over, washed his underclothes herself." Margaret didn't look up. She brushed the skins aside, reached for another potato. Every time he woke, he'd call her name. Not the woman he left her for, not the kids, just Birdie. Alma exhaled, a quiet laugh. Not mocking, not even sad. More like something remembered, fully and simply. Hurt her his whole life, then got sick and called for the one he left behind. And she still stayed, still cared. Margaret nodded, eyes still on the basket of potatoes. Maybe they forgave him. Alma paused, looked over. "You think they forgot what he did to them?" Margaret didn't answer right away. She turned the last potato in her hand, scraped off the bit of skin near the bottom, and let it fall into the bowl of water. The water, once clear, had turned cloudy. Her voice came after a quiet moment, steady, low. Maybe they forgave him because they didn't want to carry the pain any longer. No one replied. Alma nodded, just once. Not in agreement, not to end the talk. More like someone folding a small truth and putting it away. The kitchen fell silent again. Just the sound of a paring knife tapping against the rim of the bowl, the soft patter of rain settling on the porch roof. No lesson spelled out, no comfort given, just a sentence spoken when hands were clean and the potato water had turned to milk. The soup had started to simmer. Alma stood by the stove, stirring gently. The scent of onion and potato rose slowly into the kitchen, which remained unlit except for the pale light from the window. After a while, without turning around, she asked, "Do you ever think about Ethan?" Margaret was stacking bowls into the wicker rack beside the sink. Her hand paused just slightly on the rim of the last one, not stiff, not startled, only still. Her voice came after a short silence, low and steady. "I still remember Ethan, not to be sad, just to remind myself I once loved someone that deeply." Alma didn't respond right away. She looked back at Margaret for a moment, then gave a small nod, as if to say the answer had landed exactly where it needed to. The pot hissed gently. A few drops bubbled over and sizzled on the stovetop, soft and quiet. No more words were exchanged, but none were needed. The soup was done. The smell of potatoes, onion, and sweet basil rose gently in the small kitchen, like a thin blanket laid across the room. Margaret turned off the stove. She said nothing, just lifted the ladle and filled 3 bowls, her hands steady, her motions slow. A small breath escaped her nose, almost indistinguishable, perhaps tired, perhaps relieved. She turned to Alma. "Would you ask Mrs. Hetty from the middle house to come eat? There's enough for 3. Alma nodded and stepped out onto the porch. Margaret set the bowls on the table, added a pinch of chopped cilantro to each one. She didn't look toward anyone. She didn't need to. Her voice, when she called them to the table, was no louder than usual, but something in it had let go. Nothing heavy, nothing bitter, just like the soundless fall of a last leaf from a branch in late season. No one brought up Ethan's name again. No one asked anything more. And in that silence, there was understanding. Something had passed through and also passed on. Not explained, not defined, Just a bowl of soup, ready to serve, a steady morning rain, and a woman with a quiet heart, offering a little extra to whoever needed it.
It was late autumn. The sun came down early. The evening light slanted across the porch roof, touching the lavender pots that bent gently in the cool breeze. Margaret sat in a wooden chair with a fabric seat, the one she'd repaired herself. In front of her, a small gas stove set near the steps. The pot of stew simmered softly, and its warmth filled the air, settling into her clothes, her hair. Alma trimmed vegetables nearby. Darlene dried the stack of bowls, setting them down one by one on a long table made from salvaged wood and old door panels. They didn't talk much, just a few glances passed, a nod here and there, footsteps slow, familiar. From the other houses, more women came. Some brought fruit or bread or just a folded tablecloth. One used a cane. Another sat down, stood up again, forgetting what she meant to do. But no one hurried. No one minded. Everything moved as if it had found its own rhythm, gentle, unforced. The light bulb above the table began to show brighter than the last of the sun. Steam rose from the pot and the ginger teapot nearby. Hands reached for one another, quietly, not for warmth, but for being near. Margaret ladled one last spoonful into the final bowl. She reached into her coat and took out a small handkerchief, always folded neatly in her pocket. On the edge, the faint embroidery, Leonard James, not held for memory's sake, but because the name had never quite left her. She held the handkerchief in her palm. She didn't press it to her chest, didn't kiss the cloth, just held it, like someone laying a small stone on a settled grave, not out of sorrow, but to say, "I'm still here." She looked up. The sky had gone copper. High above, slow-moving clouds pulled like a soft current. Behind her, Alma called out, "Dinner's ready." Margaret didn't answer at once. She looked toward the horizon, not waiting anymore, but lacking nothing. One slow breath, one long look. Then she stood and turned inside, leaving the last of the light behind, as if it too had finished its work.